All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty of variables, like how to use them, and we're going to also be covering what's going on behind the scenes so that we can really understand how variables work. So, how do we use variables in Java? Remember, we're using Java, so we have to figure out how does Java want us to use and specify variables. So there's three things that we have to provide. One, we have to provide the name of the variable, and we have to provide the variable type, and then we also have to provide the value that we want to store in the variable. One thing to note is there's two different variable types. There's a primitive type and then a reference type. We're going to cover the reference types and how those work in the future. So for primitive type variables, there are four, and you're going to use these. You're going to enter. You're going to use these. Yeah, you're just going to use these. So one is int, and int means integer. So if you remember in our example, we were storing our calculations in an integer, and integers are whole numbers. So like 1, 2, -5. I have -5 twice, but it's a whole number. And then you can see the example that kind of mirrors what we did in our previous example. We define, okay, we want to make a variable of integer type, so that's int. And that's how Java, again, this is the rules for Java. And then the name of the variable, here it's items in store. And then we want to store the value 10. And so we do that by putting equals and then 10. The other variable type is double. And if we have a variable type of double, that means that the variable is going to be holding decimal numbers. And these can be positive or negative decimal numbers. I have an example of that below. The other variable type is character type. And a variable of a character type is going to hold characters. So those are just single characters, right? Like the letters of the alphabet, essentially. And then those can be lowercase or uppercase. One important thing about the character type is you can see that it's, in the example, it's a single quote. And so in Java, that's how we have to specify the value that we want to store in the character variable. It has to be single quote. It can't be double quote. That's the rule of Java. That's how Java wants us to do it. And then the last variable type that's a primitive is booleans. And those are variables that hold either true or false. And you can see the example there. All right, so let's talk about what's going on behind the scenes with primitive type variables. This is important because actually primitive type variables, from a behind the scenes behavior perspective, they function differently than reference type variables. And I'm gonna talk about the behavior of reference type variables in the future. So right now we're focusing on primitive types. And then for anybody who's taking like an AP Computer Science course or an intro to programming and you're using Java, you're probably going to be tested on understanding what's going on behind the scenes and being able to know the difference between primitive types and reference types. All right, so let's get into the example. Now let's say that we're creating a integer and it's x and we want it to store 5. So what's going on behind the scenes is Java is going to create a space in memory, and then in that space in memory, it's going to store the value 5. So whenever we use x, what Java is doing is it knows that x has a space in memory, and it goes to that space in memory and pulls out what's in there. In our case, it's 5, and so x, whenever we use x, it's going to be using 5. If we in the future change x to equal 10, then Java is going to go to wherever 5 is stored, or wherever x, the place in memory for x, and it's going to change that value to 10. There could be a scenario where we create a new variable. So let's say we want to create a variable y and we want it to equal x. So what Java is going to do is it's going to create a new space for y, and it's going to look at what's in x. It looks in x and it knows that 5 is in x. And then in our space that it created for y, it's going to put 5 in that space. So they're both going to be equaling y, but they all have their separate spaces with the value 5. So this is what's going on behind the scenes, and like I said, it's important